possibility both to chat amongst you, which of course will distract you from listening to us, but that's what we have to deal with. But particularly, you will be able to post questions. I will see them on this tablet, and there's also the possibility to vote for the questions that you deem most interesting. And during the Q&A session, we'll see which of the questions gathered most interest, and then there's a possibility for us to ask them. You will also be able to ask questions in the traditional way with two of our colleagues walking around with microphones. Without further ado, I'd quickly like to introduce the panel to you. We have Maria de Mertzis, who is both at Bruegel, I think, one of the most interesting economic policy think tanks in Brussels. She's also at the European University Institute in Florence. During the financial crisis, you helped the Dutch central bank make sense of what was going on there, of the global financial meltdown. I hope they heeded your advice. We have Enrico Letta, who was both Prime Minister of Italy a decade ago, and more recently, leader of the Italian Social Democrats, of the Partito Democratico. And you're currently president of the Delors Institute. And you have published a very important report about how to improve Europe's economic competitiveness, which was published in spring. And I'd also like to touch upon that and the lessons we can draw from it. We have next to you Sophie Brandschlegel, who is Director of Studies at the Delors Institute. You worked as a political advisor in Westminster. You taught at Sciences Po recently, I think. And you're working both on questions of democracy and, I think, democratic representation, on, I think, also sort of authoritarian political movements, and the question how democratic parties, democratic systems can react to them. So that'll be, I hope, a topic we can touch upon. And last but not least, we have Jim Claus, a man who was in the room during a huge part of recent history, of most recent history, when European leaders were having their European councils. I'm wondering, is that a blessing or a curse? Are you recovering from that?
It's great, but it's nice to be out too.
You have an extremely interesting career. You started in the diplomatic service of Luxembourg. You worked both in the European Commission as head of cabinet. You then moved to the council. You actually joined, if I'm not mistaken, you were made responsible for the external questions of the fight against terrorism shortly after the attacks of 9/11. You were in charge of transatlantic relations with the US during a time when those relations became a bit iffy. And you are currently heading TEPSA, which is the Trans-European Policy Studies Association, which is a network of European policy studies bodies and institutions. I would actually like to start with you, Maria. And I have a very basic question. If you look back at the past 5 years, where did Europe get stronger facing those different challenges and crises? And where did its weakness show particularly?
Right, well, thank you very much for the question, and thank you for inviting me in this panel. It's interesting, every 5 years is an artificial way of thinking about policy, but since there is a change of leadership, or at least partial change of leadership in the EU, it's a good time to take stock. And in sort of thinking of preparing for today, I was thinking, what did we say in a similar event in 2019? And it's quite interesting that whatever we said back in 2019, nothing happened. I mean, the past 5 years were beyond any of our expectation in terms of how the world turned out. So I mean, a number of very significant crises. I will never forget the March of 2020, being at the office. And then, of course, in Belgium, and the Belgian government was about to announce the closing of schools. And in that evening, they did announce the closing of schools, following what France had done. And actually, I remember that it would take 6 months to see my colleagues in person again. These types of things that are shocks of a significant importance, and they have changed Europe. And actually, the response to that pandemic crisis has been one of the aspects, in my view, where Europe managed to grow stronger. There have been mistakes made at the beginning, mistakes that shouldn't have been made, but they were made. But very quickly, in those 3 months, from March all the way to June, I think, Europe put together, I shouldn't say Europe, I say the EU institutions and countries put together a remarkable amounts of help for the citizens, for the companies, to preserve economic power, to preserve continuity, and of course to manage health, because at the time was in fact the acute problem of the pandemic. More than 1 million Europeans have actually died as a result of COVID-19. Back then, we mustn't forget that. Countries were allowed to put forward measures up to 8% of GDP money that was either given or promised as help to countries. The European Central Bank put together an incredible amount of help in the form of bond buying, which is a way of helping governments sustain economic power. And then, of course, there were other programs that were put together, the European Commission and unemployment help. It was called SURE, the European Stability Mechanism, put money together. It was never used, but a lot of things were done. And of course, the pinnacle of the help, and here I think is perhaps the biggest win, and I would be interested to see what my panelists think, the biggest win was the creation of the Next Generation EU program, which was unique both in its size of European money, but also in the way that it was financed, which was common debt. As you know, we may or may not know, but common debt is not something that is allowed by the EU treaties, but this was something that was allowed in the context of a one-off event. And that is, of course, where Europe became stronger. We preserved whatever we could in economic powers and to come out of that shock. After that, of course, the war in Ukraine, a very unjust war, not that there is much just wars, but a very unjust war. In terms of the Europeans, the energy crisis that ensued created inflation that was unprecedented for the past 30 years. It's something that, of course, and it was the type of inflation that you couldn't really do much about. At least under the beginning, you had to manage the second round effects of inflation. But that was a very difficult policy problem to deal with, and now we are out of it 3 years later, 2.5 years later. So these things have made the responses, the speed, and by comparison to the financial crisis, the speed at which the European Union came together, countries came together to provide help, sustain the problem itself, either health problem or energy problem, and come out of it. But not all is rosy. I mean, the EU has come out of it in some ways bruised out of this. The European economy is facing some sort of an erosion of the industrial competitiveness. We need to deal with that. And of course, the world around us is a lot more hostile, and how we manage that will be an issue. And the last thing I'll say is that also the money is reducing. The fiscal space that we have as European Union to deal with the next 5 years or the next 10 years is smaller than what it was back then. These will be the challenges, but we'll come to that in the next round.
Thank you. Jim, there's one thing Maria mentioned as sort of the pinnacle of Europe's crisis response, which is the creation of the Next Generation EU fund. I remember when Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron finally agreed on well, actually, I think Macron didn't really have to agree on anything. It was rather Angela Merkel had to be convinced to set up this common fund to fight the adverse effects of the pandemic. Some people started to get very dreamy. And I remember the German finance minister of that time referring to this as being the Hamilton moment of Europe. That finance minister later became a chancellor of Germany. It's Olaf Scholz. I'm not sure if he was serious or ironic. He has a fine sense of irony. Is that huge fund of money? If you talk to people in Brussels, especially in the Commission, many, and the Parliament, many become very dreamy-eyed about it and say, this could be the template for further common means of financing common purposes, such as the acquisition of weapons to support the Ukrainian government against the Russian aggression, or such as the reindustrialization of European defense industry. Was that a Hamilton moment, or are we fooling ourselves?
Well, we're going to find out whether it was a Hamiltonian moment in 50 years' time. You never know at the time what will be the long-term effects. But of course, you've put your finger on one of the key challenges for the EU. If you look at all the major challenges we are facing, be it digital, climate change, defense, migration, they all will cost a lot of money. Now, the fact of the matter is that the EU budget is a mere 1% of GDP. So the answer cannot just lie in the EU budget. And even if we increase it quite significantly, it will not be enough. And that is why the new generation approach, which is quite a revolutionary approach, with the Commission being asked to go to the financial markets to borrow money and then to transmit that money either via gifts or loans to the member states, was important. I am deeply convinced that in the future, whatever people now say, and at the time this was adopted, I was present in the room, they negotiated for 5 days and 4 nights, the so-called frugals were saying this is not a precedent. In the EU terms, when people say this is not a precedent, you can be bloody well sure that it will be a precedent sooner or later. So I am deeply convinced that we will need this. And even that is not enough, and I'm sure that Enrico Letta will talk about that. We also need to mobilize finance much more in the EU. We have each year 300 billion going to the United States, which could be invested here, but I leave this to Enrico Letta, who knows much more about this. Let me just say one other word on coming to your first question. What I was struck with is how well, in a way, the EU managed the various crises, since 2008, actually. Sometimes, yesterday I heard someone saying that we have to change everything because the system doesn't deliver. I don't believe in that. I think our system is far from perfect. But if I look back over those years, including the last 5 years, on every single of the crises, we have become more integrated. We've created the European Stability Mechanism, 70,000 billion in 2012. We have empowered the central bank to become a bit more like a traditional federal bank. We have, on migration, beefed up Frontex, the agency which helps on the policing of external borders. Then, of course, in the COVID crisis, RRF, joint procurement, game changer. If you apply this more generally, it will be a real game changer. Then, of course, the RRF, which you mentioned, and then under Putin's influence, this geopolitical move to open the perspective of enlargement to Ukraine. It's a game changer. It will be very complicated, I say it immediately, but it is a game changer. Financing weapons for Ukraine with the EU, with European money, let's put it this way, is revolutionary. And adopting 13 sanctions packages against Putin is also. Now, having said this, there are many things which you can criticize, and all of this, and one of the things which also strikes me is each time, because we are not a state, we don't have a government, we have common governance, each time there is a crisis, we fumble, we stumble, it's very chaotic, it's sometimes haphazard. In the end, we get there, but it's quite slow, and particularly at the subprime crisis time, we were too slow. And so my final word for this first intervention is we have to learn from the crisis all the lessons we can draw and become more resilient for the future.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to the question of how to finance all these responses to these challenges when we look forward to the future. But Enrico, what I'd like to ask you now, Jim mentioned at least 3 topics or decisions the European Union took, which were very important, but which also caused a massive populist kind of anti-EU backlash. It's refugee policy, the role of the European Central Bank and the question how it can intervene in financial crisis, especially in Germany and the Netherlands, the country I come from, Austria. That was highly contentious. And then, of course, the creation of financial means to support Ukraine to defend itself. You were leader of the Italian Social Democrats recently during that period. In your experience, and as we all know, Italy is a country that is in a sense a laboratory of political developments in Europe, and you're now facing a very strong populist government that currently seems to be fairly well supported by a huge chunk of population. What can mainstream pro-European parties learn from the past 5 years and from Europe's response, and which contradictions or dangers do they have to tackle?
I think the main lesson is about pragmatism. It's about the fact that we have to introduce all the ideas on how to be more integrated, not because of an ideology, but because of common sense and good solutions for the people. Jim just mentioned this point about financial weakness of the fragmentation of our financial markets, and the fragmentation is bringing money out of the European Union. And the same is for defense. You mentioned defense. The fragmentation of Europe of defense is helping jobs creation in Michigan, Wisconsin, Turkey, South Korea, because we are spending all our money, not all, but 80% of what we spent to help Ukraine was to buy non-EU military furnitures, was to help Michigan, Wisconsin, South Korea, Turkey, and this is because of the fragmentation. This is because of our fragmentation. So the key point is that integration is not an ideology, it's a need. And it is a need, and this is the core of my report, the report that European institutions asked me to write, is exactly trying to move from the Delors legacy. And Sophie will say something on that too. Delors legacy, because Delors was very pragmatic. Last time I met him, because before he passed away, he told me, remember, I created the single market, that is the most powerful European tool and European achievement, with an agreement and an alliance with the most anti-European leader in Europe. That was Margaret Thatcher at that time, because of pragmatism and because of the need to solve problems and to be more competitive, jobs creation, and so on. So my point is that you asked about the past. We were, in the last 5 years, very good in reacting to crisis. Very good. What Jim said just about Next Generation EU, and Maria as well, is there. It's a fantastic achievement. And the same for the energy crisis, the same for the creation of DSM and other important tools. The key point is that what happened at the world level with the rise of China and India is so enormous in terms of timing and acceleration that it is not enough for us to have reactions. We need to act. This is the key point for the next 5 years, in my view. And this is the core of my report. We need not only to react to what is happening, because reacting to what is happening is absolutely not enough with the big challenges we have. We were, when the single market was created 40 years ago, 35 years ago, we were all big countries in Europe. Big countries at world level. It was the period in which we created the G7, and all big countries. China, at that time, won 5 gold medals in the Olympics. 5. Now, China won 40 gold medals. And today, India was China of 35 years ago. In the next 35 years, India will be the next China. So it is clear that there's a topic, that's an issue of dimension for all of us. And we have only one solution. The only solution is integration on the topics that you mentioned, to avoid that our money of European taxpayers can help job creation in South Korea or in Pennsylvania. We are very happy with workers in Pennsylvania and South Korea, but I think it's maybe better to use our money to have jobs creation in Austria or in Luxembourg, in Italy, in the Netherlands, in Estonia. And this is possible only with integration. In markets, in the report I presented not only ideas for the future, but also the demonstration that the single market is not integrated. There are so many topics where it is not integrated. And my last word is about the experience I had in the organization of the trip, the journey that I had for the preparation of the report. I visited all the member states. I was in Austria twice. And to visit all the member states, I started thinking how to do it, how to travel around Europe. Europe is the smallest continent in the world. We decided to go green. In my own country, Italy, I used to travel by high-speed train, so my first idea was to say, I will organize a travel by high-speed train within Europe. And I realized, what you know very well, that it is totally impossible to travel by high-speed train through European capitals. You can travel by high-speed train through capitals of the regions within countries. But if you want to join Vienna and Budapest and Prague and Warsaw, it's impossible to do it by high-speed train. You have to fly. Or you have to take the Interrail, as our young people, when they are 18 or 19, do. So just one example to say, we have a fantastic developed system of high-speed train within our countries, but we don't have it at European level. If you want to travel from one big Chinese city to another big Chinese city, you do it by high-speed train. And we can't within Europe because of the lack of the European investments. I think this is a very, very important experiential point to say why we need not only reactions, but actions to be at the level of the world challenges today.
Thank you. It's possibly also a bit easier to... One could, of course, also argue it's possibly easier to expropriate farmers in Nanjing than it is in Europe, because we have the rule of law and we respect private property. But I think we all share your point. And sometimes it's even impossible to travel in low-speed train in Europe. So it's a challenge. I came in from Munich with 3 trains and a bus, and it kind of worked. So I hope I get back. I hope I didn't jinx that now. Sophie, getting back from trains to the stage here. Last year, you published a book, the title of which I'll clumsily translate as The End of Order as Usual, How We Have to Rethink Power. In your assessment, what did Europe get right about power in this period we spoke about? And where did it really show it has no idea how to wield power, especially when dealing with autocracies?
Very good question. My first reaction was to say it didn't get much right about power, unfortunately, because it has a very... So we live in a world where you see that our conception of power is extremely regressive, very Machiavellian. We understand power as power over others rather than power with or power to do something. I would say that the original idea of the EU was to have a very progressive idea of power, to do things together, collaboratively, to find compromise together, to avoid also violence, because in the end, you know, the original idea was to say, I'm French and German, not to have bloody wars again. And it did work for quite a while for at least the member states within the EU. We could see that out of our borders we didn't manage. But the idea of having compromise, sitting in the council, being able to kind of, you know, have conflict without violence was a very positive idea of power. But the problem is that our world changed, the multilateral order changed, and even within Europe, certain leaders have changed their ideas of power, and we could see that a lot with Hungary, where we really struggle to kind of understand how they think about power, and, you know, imagining that with compromise we will find a way. And I think that's what the EU institutions, and especially the leaders, didn't get right. And I think that now that we live in that new world, where we have a Putinist regime, where we have an Orban that is, you know, going on peace missions, where we have China and potentially another Trump in the White House, Europe needs to better understand the language of power that is talked about and make sure that it defends its values, not in a way that is hypocritical, because if you think about pushbacks and returns, as they call it, it's, you know, it's not seen as something that people can believe in us. So I think we need to kind of stick to our values in a way, make sure that we show that we stick to our values, and at the same time not be naive about how other things about power. And that is especially true when you look at the democracy agenda. I think the EU did quite well. It was the summer break in Brussels, so I had the chance to talk to Jourova, and there's an interview coming out with her. You know, sometimes when they're at the end of their mandates, they do have time for think tankers, which is amazing. And we did take stock of the democracy agenda of the Commission, and I have to say, they are aware of the sense of urgency. They did quite a lot, but I think there's still a fundamental belief that, you know, leaders want to work together, that the threat comes from outside rather than within. And I think that's something where the EU needs to really become better at having an integrated approach to understand that the threat's not only from China, Iran, or Russia, but it's actually coming from within as well, that you do have parties that actively undermine the European Union, that actively want to threaten democracy, that they do not believe in those things. They don't believe that the EU is a good thing, that, you know, we should cooperate together. They are fundamentally violent in how they think about power and about, you know, statecraft, I would say. So I think not being naive and making sure that we have an integrated approach going forward is what's going to be the most important. That said, also, it's not only about democracy having an integrated approach. Maybe that's one of the challenges, and we can discuss it, where I could really see that, you know, because, and I wouldn't say it's an institutional problem, I would say it's a political problem, where you do think in silos, it's very difficult to think about stuff together, and because we have this accumulation of crises that are, on the one hand, completely systemic, like the climate crisis, and very punctual, like, you know, I don't know, the energy crisis we had. I mean, we kind of sorted that out, but you do have this accumulation, and it's very hard to kind of think about it together and make sure that the different administrations, but also the different countries, think about things together. So it gets more complex, and it's very hard to find the appropriate, I would say, design and structures to make sure that we have answers that, you know, do tackle one problem, but then create other problems on the other side.
Thank you. I've left out an important piece of information at the beginning. If you want to put questions on the app and then have them voted on, I think it works. Maybe there should have been a QR code. If you haven't scanned that to get into the thing, maybe the regie could put that up again. Voila, this one. So if you scan this, the magical mystery of computers takes you directly to this event now. That was a look back. Let's look to the future, to the imminent future. I'd like to ask all four of you the same question. What would be the most important challenge Europe is very likely going to face in the next five-ish years? And at the same time, what do you think European policymakers, leaders, are insufficiently aware of? If you would have asked pretty much anyone 6 years ago, or even 5 years ago, if Europe would come to if the world would come to a standstill because of a animal-transmitted, highly infectious pandemic, they would have said, well, you've watched too much of the Hollywood movie Outbreak, and you're too much of a fan of Dustin Hoffman. And there's nothing wrong with that, but nobody would have expected the pandemic to hit the world as it did and as quickly. So my question is, what's the big challenge for the next 5 years? And is there any pandemic-like blackish swan creature sailing along? I'd like to start with you, Maria.
Easy questions first.
Yes.
So we are only allowed to pick one, or because I can think of.
Well, if you can figure out of more, that's good. But I'd sort of like to boil it down to one or maybe two, so we can sort of structure our thinking around it a bit.
No, look. I mean, I think you ask a very important question about how do you prepare about the things you don't know about, right? And it's a good way of thinking about. First, what do we know about? How can we prepare about the things that we know are coming? Because there are challenges we know they are coming. And then how do we begin to think about things that we cannot even begin to fathom, right? I mean, it's something like a tail risk, which we should really talk about. And I think In the past, we didn't talk enough about tail risks. We need to talk about tail risks a lot more. But if you allow me about the things that we do know, because there are many things that we need to tackle that are what I would call challenges in the sense that they involve complex trade-offs with little means and little capacity to coordinate. I mean, I think the rail example is a metaphor for tracks. You know, every country has got its own tracks. The tracks don't communicate, and therefore we can't coordinate. I mean, this is the tracks is the thing that we need. I can think of many examples where this metaphor works. Look, we start with an imminent one, and that is Ukraine. I mean, unless we continue to support Ukraine, to bring Ukraine to a successful outcome, we will face a real possibility of war within our borders. I think this is the most existential one. Well, and after that, of course, comes the economy and the green transition. All of these, I mean, now I'm violating the restrictions you gave me, but I think you cannot close your eyes to the fact that the green transition needs to be accelerated. I mean, one number that I think resonates, just in 2023, we used 11% of the climate budget that we have set for ourselves and is consistent with our targets. 11% of the remaining budget in just 1 year. You know, acceleration is the word here when it comes to the climate. And of course, we need to do it in a fair way. And we need to do it beyond our borders. I mean, I think climate finance needs to be at the top of the agenda so that we can bring the whole world in the global public good that climate is. And of course, the economy. I mean, you know, we need the economy. This is how elections are being won and lost everywhere, including in the EU. We need to make sure that the welfare state remains what it is, and that we have jobs, and that we have competitiveness in the context of the global environment. I prefer to talk about productivity rather than competitiveness, but that will be there. But when it comes to tail risks, and I think that's important, how do you begin to think of the unthinkable? The Americans actually call this the unknown unknowns. I think that's a very nice way of and indeed policy needs to not prepare just for the known knowns, but also for the unknown unknowns. Look, we are in a world that is a lot more fragmented than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And there is a shift of powers. And how to deal with this? How do we see Europe in the context of superpowers and also of competing what I call business models? China does things differently than the way that the EU and the US does. The Western model is very different to the Chinese model in terms of doing business. We like to think our model is better, but I think we need to find a way of have peaceful coexistence and of competing models. We need a common ground, a common denominator to deal with the different business models. And of course, we need to bring the whole world in here, because I think we don't create many friends in the context of the way that we do business, actually. I was shocked by the UN, the first UN vote when the war erupted, when 70% of population, in terms of population, not GDP, but in terms of population, voted either with Russia or neutral. I mean, we are condemning this war, but the rest of the world isn't. So, we need to find ways of existing there. We need multilateralism. We cannot have unilateral agreements. Preserve this multilateralism. So Europe needs to think about that. What is our position in this context? How do we manage that? And on the tail risks, which I think is the question, I really worry about Taiwan. I think that could be an important risk, which is going to really pivot power. I don't want it to have a view on Taiwan, but I know that if it were to erupt, it will create big differences, particularly in the US, and by implication, it will also involve the rest of the world. I think this is a big tail risk we need to prepare about. For the rest, what are your tail risks?
Jim, your take.
Oliver, I'm not going to answer your question about black swans for a very simple reason. I've never met one. The only thing I do know is that there will be black swans. And so my take is slightly different. I'm not trying to predict what the crises are. I'm not very good at that. What I do want to talk about is how should the European Union increase its autonomy in the world? Because in a multipolar world, we need to be more autonomous. And that raises a certain number of questions. There are 3 prerequisites, in my view. The first one is to look at the world how it is. We were used to this relatively cozy world of the bipolar world where we were cuddling under the wings of the Americans. That's over. We have to reinvent our role on the global chessboard. That raises very many questions. The one elephant in the room, which the Europeans rarely talk about, is our relationship with America in that respect, because it has an influence on our relations with China. And to some extent, we seem to believe that we always must follow the Americans. I think on China, we should not follow the Americans on everything. We'll always be closer to them. So we need a frame of mind which is different. We have to think about ourselves as a potential global player. The second thing we need is a method. I go back to one of the forefathers of the European integration, it's Jean Monnet, who always prepared balance sheets about policies. We need a concerted effort under the guidance of the European Council with a strong input from the Commission, looking at all our policies, looking at where we have strengths and weaknesses, and work out action plans to address them. And there I could, of course, talk about all the digital. I mean, we're good at regulation, but we are not present in the market. Climate change, we are now entering the difficult period. Defense, we will have to rethink it. I don't think we should talk now about the European army. It's absurd, but we have to get into it because the Americans, sooner or later, will not provide for our defense. Whoever comes. I don't know how long it will take, so we have to grow up. We have the capabilities. We spend more than 250 billion a year, but we spend it very badly. We have to get serious on that. So on all of those issues. And lastly, we need a reflection on governance. Sometimes in the Brussels bubble, there seems to be an impression that for every political problem we need a treaty change and institutional change. I don't believe in that. I think that the institutional framework we have is not perfect, but it's adapted to what the EU is, a union of states and peoples. I do not believe in a federal solution. I mean, the idea, listening to a French intervening yesterday and calling for federation and the European state and all that, I mean, my question is, would you like to run France from Brussels? I mean, if you see how difficult it is from Paris, but from Brussels, just forget about it.
If you ask Mélenchon and Le Pen, it already is run from Brussels.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's what. Yes, to some extent it is, and that's good for the French. But and I think we should do a bit more.
Currently, it's maybe not such a bad idea.
We should do a bit more of it. But the answer is not institutional. I am in favor to federalize policies, as we've done on joint procurement, for instance, or the RF, rather than institutions. It's much more productive. It's more pragmatic. I'm totally in line with Enrico. And governance is important. There are so many things we can do in governance without changing the treaties. For instance, we could get our act together on external representation and stop these ludicrous battles in Brussels between presidents who both think they are president of the union and none of them is. We should draw the conclusion from the fact that we have a euro in terms of external representation. Financing, we have to have a completely new look at financing. There are many, many other issues. I talked about procurement. If we apply joint procurement, as we've done for the vaccines, for energy purchases or purchases of weapons, it will be a complete game changer. And that's the kind of thing I am looking for. Now, if in the longer term we need treaty change, by all means, let's do it. I've participated in all the negotiations on treaty change between 1985 and 2009. We hardly did anything else. I think we need a pause on that one, but sooner or later we can come back to it. But for the time being, look at the policies, look at what needs doing, and then just do it. Thank you.
Thank you. Enrico?
I think we have now, for the next 5 years, one big question. And the big question is, I come back to what Jim said in the first intervention about the transitions. We decided to have transition. We decided to have the green, digital, and just transition. We know the transition costs. And we know there's a fantastic report written by Selma Mahfouz and Jean Pisani-Ferry last year. Fantastic, because it is a report written by people believing in the transition and saying clearly it costs, and we have to find money. Otherwise, so if we are not able in this period, in the next months, to say how to find this money, we will have all the answers and the reactions I received in my journey around Europe. where I met farmers, I met entrepreneurs, I met trade unions in the automotive sector, and they told me all the same. And the point was, you, the European leaders, you decided to go green. You told us it will cost a lot, and you didn't say anything on how to find this money. So, fourth, as farmer, as worker, as entrepreneur, I think I will pay part of that. And so I say, no, please, I stop it. So the big backlash that we are facing now is the backlash of all these transitions, because we were very good in, how we say, targeting the dates, the missions, the goals. But if the transition becomes something that is, how we say, too heavy for the middle class and for social diseases, that today that will be the main problem of the European Union. This is why I think we have to combine an answer to this question, because when I say it costs, there are a range between 500 billion euros to 700 billion euros per year for the next 10 years. And if we are not able to clearly say how to find this money, it will be a backlash, a political backlash. It is not an easy answer for the reasons of what Jim said about the different approaches to the common, how we say, loans and next generation, a new next generation EU and so on. There's no agreement on a new next generation EU. That is very clear. A part of the European countries, and Austria is one of them, are saying that no more common money and no more, now we say, fiscal European capacity. So the key point is that we have to find an agreement on a compromise. My point is that we have to start from private money. Not because I don't think that we need public money, but for a very simple reason, which is the main difference, one of the main differences between European competitiveness and American competitiveness. Our savings are not feeding our real economy. The savings in the US are there to feed the American real economy. Our savings are, first of all, bonds, very conservative bonds. And part of our savings are flying to the US, because the US market is more integrated, more interesting, and our market is fragmented. So we come back to the usual problem. The usual problem is that we are still with national flags. And we consider that the national flag is so crucial to allow all European countries to have a stock exchange, an authority for regulating markets in countries of 1 million of people. It doesn't work like that. We need to integrate, and we need to keep our money here and to invest our money in real economy. So this is why I suggest you to read page 30 and 31 of the report. The report can tell you that the report has a dual use. The report has a dual use. The second use is for solutions. The first use is if you suffer of insomnia, because if you suffer of insomnia, the report is fantastic. But I can tell you that pages 30 and 31 are very good, because there I try to put a tool on the table. And the tool is how to help savers in Europe to have a European tool, to have better interests, and at the same time, how to put this money into real economy and into the financing of the transition. If I repeat, if we are not able to do so, it will be a backlash. I am optimistic. I end up on that. I am optimistic because I saw von der Leyen very, very open to that. She took the new brand, not because it's the one I put in my report, but I think because it's the right direction to say we have to move from the discussion on the capital markets union to the creation of a savings and investments union. You immediately understand the difference between the two. We had 10 years of discussion on capital markets union. If you go to the people, if one leader goes to the people and you say, hey, voters, I will promise you we will have the capital market union.
That's right.
Can you imagine the reaction of the people? The reaction is natural. It's not for me. It is for bankers. So, but if you organize a different framework where it is possible to put together savings, to use savings to give more gain and interest to the people, and to use it to strengthen real economy, that changes everything. And this is why I'm very happy that von der Leyen is in this direction. And I think from Altbach, because we are all pushing for having a great 5 years, we have to ask von der Leyen to be brave, because she has the power now. She received a big legitimacy from the European Parliament. She has to be brave.
I'll quickly dip into your report a bit later on one of these points. I'd first be interested in Sophie's analysis of what's coming there at Europe and how it should deal with.
Yeah, I'd like to jump on what Enrico just said about the transitions, and I will, because I also work for Jacques Delors, the ones in Brussels, where we work a lot on sustainability issues. This Delors legacy is really important to make sure that you do have, as I mentioned, an integrated approach where you do not only look at the environment, but also at social and economic aspects. And I think that's exactly what we mean, is that without having the social and economic aspects within the green transition, it's never going to work. And I think that's been not easy to do. I'm not going to say that it's an easy feast and that it's very easy to find the right solutions. But I would say that von der Leyen has been quite ambitious in what she has done in the past 5 years, and that now the big question is on implementation. And I know it's less attractive and sexy than to discuss new policy initiatives, and like big ideas and big priorities. But on the Green Deal, we really need to implement what we have, because it's already quite a lot, and I don't see that happening. And we see that member states have a tendency to, diverge a lot from EU legislation that has been, by not implementing it properly, and also by, not complying with it. And I think that's something that's really dangerous for Europe, because the whole legitimacy of the EU project and the EU political system is that you do have common law. And if you don't implement it, then what's the point in actually having all these new priorities? And I think that's the big danger I see in the next 5 years, is that the Commission might have a little bit of a tendency to overpromise and then not be able to deliver, because we have the political situation that we have in the Council. And I think being a little bit more maybe honest about what can be done and what cannot be done would be really good. And I hope that on a capital markets union we will be able to do it. But I think it also comes down not only to von der Leyen, because I think she has been showing quite a lot of ambition in the last 5 years, but also from national political leaders, especially France, Germany, and Poland as the big three. Of course, also Spain. I mean, the big member states. I'm not forgetting the small ones; they're important too. But to kind of get the political backing as well to be able to move forward. And I don't see that a lot, unfortunately. And I think that's the big issue we see. Is it's not an institutional one that much as a political one, where we won't be able to find the solutions because we are too fragmented, because some people do not necessarily want that, because there are tons of vested interests in certain aspects. I'm thinking about agriculture, for instance, where we know that we're far removed from having, the alignment that we need with the Green Deal. But what you saw in the last year is that you did have a political instrumentalization where basically politicians use populism to say, oh, the Green Deal is against you. It's not against you, it's for you. Maybe it's not perfect, but you should chip in and try to make it better, instead of just protesting and say it's not for us. And I think that kind of, I would even say manipulation of voters to kind of take positions that are against their own interests. You can see it during Brexit. You can see it, I think, now in agriculture and on green issues. I think that's something that's really dangerous by manipulating voters and citizens. And I think that's something that that affects the EU as well. Maybe just one point, and I thought Maria would say that a bit more. I mean, we discussed that the biggest issue will be money, and I think that's really the big elephant in the room. On the RFF, the reimbursement of it, and then the EU budget. And I know that the Belgian presidency really tried to get the legislation through. It didn't manage. So I think these are discussions that will be really, really conflictual and difficult. And another thing is that I do think also that the priorities are right. We have security, we have competitiveness. I would very much hope that, because we know that the devil is in the detail as always, that these issues won't be seen as contradictory to each other, so that, for instance, security will be seen as antagonizing democracy, that will say, oh, we need a very strong executive power and transparency is really bad for us, so checks and balances, ooh, that's not for us in a hard security world, or that you have competitiveness and that instead, and that because we need to have a strong economic power, we're going to say, oh, we don't really need these old climate things. So to have that kind of combination of things and to make sure we don't see it as antagonizing policy fields, that would be really important. And I hope that, for instance, with a clean industrial deal, we are going in the right direction, although I'm always interested in reading the strategic agenda, because you have to read between the lines and see what's not in there or what kind of words they use, and they talk about clean and not green, so I'm wondering what it means. They talk about a vibrant agricultural sector, so I'm like, vibrant, is it green, is it not green? So I'm kind of wondering in which direction it goes sometimes.
Can I just very briefly, because we need about 15 or 18 minutes for questions, so we have about 2 more minutes here amongst ourselves. Very briefly, Maria, when I interviewed you in May about the lessons drawn from the euro crisis and the financial crisis, you said the problem is politicians only act when they feel the knife at their necks, sort of the imminent existential threat. That's when they act. I think there's agreement here on the stage, and probably amongst you as well, that all the things we want to do will cost a lot of money. There seems not to be too much willingness amongst national leaders, regardless of what the Commission wants or not, to chip in that money. Is the knife not close enough?
I actually think this is human nature. I mean, you don't stop smoking until you have that small heart attack. That, let's just hope that the heart attack is a small one, because if it's a big one, then that is the end of it. I mean, but human nature, change doesn't happen very often, and you see it in politics. However, I will say that the reaction to crisis, from the financial crisis all the way to the most recent one on the energy, we see a big difference, and that is acceleration in decision making. So we have learned something. But we are talking about a megamoth of 27 country leaders, all with country agendas, elections that are being decided at the country level, not the EU level, and rails that don't communicate, right? So, I mean, that's what I will call is the physical limitations of the EU, in the sense that, I mean, we're still dealing with 27 nations that have got different ideas about what their future is. But if I may, can I come to the finance? Because I think it's important to have more concrete proposals when it comes to what about the money and how we're going to finance it. I just wanted to agree with Enrico on the importance of private money. And to give you yet one more number, the European Commission is forecasting that next year the EU will have a current account surplus again of 2.3%. 2.3% of GDP is more or less the money what we need yearly for the green and the digital transition. About 450 billion additional over and above current investments. And yet, a current account surplus means that the savings investment imbalance means that the money is leaving EU borders and is invested outside the EU. Now, how do we motivate this money to stay in? What do we do? And here I would suggest 2 things. The first one is repurpose the EU budget to serve EU public goods. Yeah, I mean, EU public goods are goods that, unless are provided at the EU level, they will not be provided appropriately. Yeah? Climate is the most obvious one. Why don't we invest on the green transition jointly? Because we're talking about a public good, ultimately a global public good, but certainly an EU public good. So repurpose the EU budget that will be discussed in the next 5 years to serve very concretely EU public goods. For that, I would recommend the creation of a strategic investment fund. Why strategic? Because you cannot be changing ideas on what you should be invested in. Decide on a few strategic objectives and finance them commonly, otherwise you won't be able to do that. And then the second suggestion I have is to think about the role of the European Investment Bank. The European Investment Bank, which is the biggest development bank in the world, for the past 20 years has never had losses, has always had profits. Now, you would say this is good. Of course it's good, but this is a public institution, and public institution not for profit. Through the statute, the EIB should not have profits. Yeah, because Bruegel is a non-for-profit institution. I know what this means. I'm not advocating that they should be making losses, but they should be taking risks. If you take risks as a public institution, you can lever up And that comes the private money. This is where the private money, you can lever up to 10 times. I mean, this is exactly what we do with the Juncker plan. The role of the EIB as a big financing institution needs to be bread and butter of our future, of how we bring the private money in, because otherwise it will be the taxpayer, again the taxpayer.
I'd like to get into the questions from that you have actually come up with on this magical machine, and also change the topic a bit. We have one question that was very popular for you is by Andro Kvinadze, who asks, should the EU take a harder stance on China given its severe violations of human rights, open support for Russia and industrial espionage / intervention into internal European politics? I think that's a question tailor-made for you, Jim. Should we be tougher on Jim? Because you said we shouldn't follow the US on everything.
Yeah.
But
let me say something which may be a bit controversial. For a long time, we pretended in the EU, that was the time when geopolitics was taken care of by the United States and still is, our security. It was very easy. We basically said our foreign policy is based on values, human rights and all of that. I think, I'm sorry to say, that's nonsense. No foreign policy is based on values. Our foreign policy is, the background of it is a system we have where we think we are democratic and we respect values and we should plead for those values and explain them. But the idea that we are going to convert the world, forget about it. It's not going to work. Secondly, on China, of course there are human rights violations in China. China has a difficult problem. China is going back to a kind of totalitarian system. I have no illusion about that. The question for us will be, do we think we are going to manage the world with a Western alliance, which is, of course, uses democracy. The Americans have used democracy in many very configurations where it was just pure power politics, because it's an imperium, it's normal. We have to get away from this. I do not say we have to forsake our values, but we have to live with China. China will be there. So the question is, what are we going to do with China? And if someone can explain to me how we are going to solve major world problems, like climate change, without China, we can, of course, say we're not going to talk to you because you treat the Uyghurs very badly. I mean, the Americans were putting pressure on us when we did an investment agreement with China over the Uyghurs. What they forgot to say is that the Uyghurs have been very badly treated for a very long time, even at the time when the Americans did their investment agreement with the Chinese. So, I mean, this kind of thing, we have to get a bit away from this. So it's a difficult issue. But on climate change, for instance, I mean, Europe today accounts for 8% of the emissions, okay? So we can do everything we like. If China, which accounts for 32%, doesn't do it, and we don't do it with them, the planet will go up in flames. And so the answer is, it's very simple to use the human rights argument, and you appeal to people, but I think statesmen, we cannot live in a world where we just talk to the democracies. And by the way, someone mentioned multilateralism, and we should remain proponents. Multilateralism is now under siege. We should remain and push for it. But what does multilateralism mean? It does not mean an alliance of democracies, I mean, with Saudi Arabia and countries like that. It means that we work with all the countries in the world.
But, sorry to interrupt, the question had a second part, which was rather about China's severe the open support for Russia and its genocidal war against the Ukrainian people, and industrial espionage intervention into internal European politics. That is an issue, isn't it? And it's an issue that could be interest-driven and not so much lovey-dovey values-driven.
No, of course. I do not say we should be soft with China. I think, for instance, I have always been in favor, even at the time when we could not use the term reciprocity, for reciprocity in trade with China. It would be extremely tough. We are a big market. We should not be naive at all, but we should stop this kind of shallow preaching, which is... and actually, there is an aspect to this. There's a Brussels aspect to this. Our member states use Brussels to do the shallow preaching. So when they send the leaders of the institutions to China, they say you have to talk about the Uyghurs and everything. And meanwhile, they go bilaterally and they do the business, And there we should be a bit careful. We should work more as a union, be more adult and grown up. I think that is really a key point.
There's another question that might kind of seek into the topic of how do we come up with the money to do the things we want to do, how do we increase competitiveness, growth, and so forth. Antoine Ferraris asks, what would you suggest to an EU policymaker on the idea of endless economic growth and sovereignty of the EU while we face an escalating environmental crisis such as biodiversity loss or the climate destabilization? How do you square these two things? On the one hand, you need growth to earn money to do things against climate change. On the other hand, you could argue a huge chunk of our current economic system actually contributes to the problem you're trying to solve. Who would like to take that? Maybe Enrico, I'll go with you, because you wrote a big report on that.
Yeah, I think what Sophie said about the fact that the transition has a green part and a social part, and we have to combine the two, is fundamental in my view. I put here one other tool that I presented in the report and I think is absolutely crucial. I come back to the problem of dimension and to the problem of scale. That is, in my view, one of the crucial problems. Why we are not able to attract money from abroad? Why we are not able to attract investments from abroad? If you speak with someone in the US, an investor in Asia, the first reaction from him is, we love you, you Europeans, you are fantastic, but you are a mess. 24 languages, 27 business laws, 27 fiscal systems. If you are in the shoes of an external investor, it's a mess. And the difference with 30 years ago, that this same investor has alternatives. This is the key point. He has alternatives. He can invest in other parts of the world. So we have to simplify. We have to simplify. And one idea to simplify is the idea of the 28th virtual state that I put in the report. It's a sort of Delaware, of European Delaware, if I may say. And the idea is the following one. If we ask me, are we able to ask each country to cancel his own business law and to pass to one business law, I say, forget it, it's impossible. For historic reasons. But if we add a 28th virtual state with his own business law, and you say to SMEs, for instance, in Europe, to say, okay, you can choose. If you choose this business law, this is working everywhere in Europe. For you, it's not, I would say, compulsory to have 50 lawyers working, helping you how to move from Austrian business law to Hungarian business law, and that's totally crazy, and the same Spain, Portugal, Italy, France. And if you have just one idea like that, once again, it is not an ideological pro-integration approach. It is very practical. Is a tool that is able to help us in being better, in attracting more investments, and in helping SMEs. I insist on that, because I don't want that the idea of scale is just gigantism. We don't want to become Americans. We want to keep our small dimension. And the small dimension can work only if the tools are effective and the tools are like that. So I think this idea of the 28th virtual state is very practical, very simple, and I hope I'm very happy because von der Leyen put it in the speech that received the vote at the European Parliament. So it's another big tool for the next 5 years.
I have to be a bit dictatorial now. We're into the last 8 minutes. We have 2 colleagues here with microphones. We're going to take questions. I'd like to group 3, and I'd like to make history today here. I'd like this to be the first panel in modern history that only makes it through the end with questions, not with statements. So please, let's make this happen. There's a question there. Can we give anyone else with a question? There's a second question here. It's fairly dark. Anyone else wants to? Let's stick with these 2 for the time being, okay? And please introduce yourself briefly and say who you are.
Yes, thank you. I'm Werner Stenk from the European Commission. First of all, congratulations, best panel I've witnessed in years, so including the moderator. On substance, you all have said, and Jim in particular, that Europe has been particularly successful since the financial crisis, say, in responding to major crises in a way that without Europe would not have worked, down to the pandemic and the war. And you also said that we have big challenges ahead of us, some of which may be unknown, and for which we absolutely have to act in a united way. And Enrico repeatedly said that we need to work together. At the same time, we're witnessing populist movements in Europe, anti-European movements that raise to power and into governments across the continent with clear messages that Europe is a mess and we don't need that. So I know how difficult it is to communicate Europe from 28 years of experience in the Commission to the outset, to the Europeans. But I think without the support of the Europeans, of citizens, everybody out there, we cannot do what you said is absolutely necessary. So how can we, that's the question, how can we communicate, what can we do to get the people on board that lose faith in the European institutions while they've been more successful than ever before?
All right, thank you. That's a really easy question.
Yeah,
Shall we take the second one as well, so you have a moment to reflect on this?
The question is easy.
Second question.
The answer is complicated.
Hello,
Please.
Irene Gine-Reichel. I'm a former ambassador in the Austrian Foreign Service and currently the president of the European Forum Alpbach Council. Thank you for a great panel. Quick question on this issue of how to best confront the unknown challenges that lie in the future. Isn't one of the best ways that we know so far to increase resilience and to strengthen societal cohesion to confront unknown crises in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. So first, how do we reignite the flame in people's hearts? And secondly, how does Europe get more resilient? Who wants to start? Go ahead, Maria.
I can start. Look, on the first question, there are no easy ways out of this, and there will never be, in my view, and I speak here not as an expert, I speak as a citizen, there is never a substitute for leadership and for politicians who are visionaries about the future. Yeah. Without politicians who take that active role, a role that says we can achieve scale if we were to do it together rather than alone individually, it's not going to happen. Because if you do have those politicians, then you have the process in a context of a 27-nation continent that we have to do certain things together, and therefore sometimes you pay more, sometimes I pay more. There is no shorthands to this. There is no easy way out of that. And there will never be a situation where you don't have the need for incredible talent at the top. And that's the way that I see that. There is no other way there's no quick solution to this. However, institutionally, I mean, I will try to offer concrete solutions to Enrico's report, how to finance certain things. The 28th solution is one of them, the EU budget is other one. These types of things, when you start having concrete results where citizens can see, help. But they're not the solution, the only solution to your question. On the unknown unknowns and the issue of resilience, and in fact, it comes back also a little bit to the question you asked originally about. The question didn't use the term degrowth, but it actually meant degrowth. It's how can we have infinite growth and stay there? I mean, I think the issue of resilience means that we don't really only look for maximizing our turnouts, our payouts. We need to care about distribution. And this is the cohesion argument is an argument of distribution. If you think about sustainability, sustainability is not just about more, it's also about equally more, because otherwise unequal outcomes are not sustainable outcomes. And we have seen this, the backlashes come because the second moment of the distribution, if you allow me to use my economic terminology, is not optimal. It's not just about the averages. We need good distribution and outcomes. And it's not just about the unknown unknowns, it's also for the known knowns as well. Policies that do not cater to good distributions are not sustainable policies on anything from green to income to everything, to education, to all these things. On the unknown unknowns, we need to move away from this design where we design policies for known circumstances and find policies that do well enough across a variety of circumstances. And the wider the variety of the circumstances, the more resilient the system.
Sophia, I'd like to ask you, I think you've also written about these issues of democratic legitimacy and people being sort of unhappy with the EU and then turning to parties that are not particularly friendly towards the project. What's your take? What needs to be done to get people more optimistic or more accommodating about the European
Don't get me
project.
started on it.
Is it
We'll
even
stay here
necessary?
for another hour.
Is it even possible? No, is there one thing? Is it even possible?
No, not necessarily. I think one of the issues, of course, in the EU is that it's seen as far removed. It's seen as very bureaucratic. It was originally not thought of as something that is close to the citizens. I mean, it was something to bring countries together and make sure that they can kind of very technocratically discuss stuff that is mostly unpoliticized. And of course, there's been a change there because we do discuss more redistributive policies. I mean, we are faced with questions now of life and death, of war, of where is the money going? How do we sustain our social systems, our ways of life? I mean, we did have a commissioner for that as well, which was controversially discussed in 2019. So it has become much more politicized, and that makes it much more difficult for the EU because they need also to communicate much better what they're doing, but it's not necessarily in their DNA, I would say. And I think one of the biggest issues I see is that you're not going to necessarily some of the stuff is quite technocratic and difficult to understand. I mean, I've been in Brussels for 5 years. I have to say, we do have tons of abbreviations. It is a very technical, working on the Green Deal. You have CBAM, you have EUDR, you have lots of regulations and directives. So it's not necessarily something that is easily also transferred to a larger public, especially not when you have 27 member states with 24 different languages. However, what can be done, and I think that's where I see the biggest actors also in charge of making sure that the EU stays legitimate and is able to do that legislation, are national actors. They're national decision makers, they're national governments, but they're also political parties. And I think we're not discussing political parties enough because in the end, European political parties don't have that much to say. In the end, national political parties, we just had European elections, they're the ones that also send people to Brussels, They're the ones that sit in the council and will kind of decide. And they're the ones making EU policy in the end. So if you do have national political parties that are not having a good EU policy, not actually having thought about it, or being anti-European, that's not really helpful for Europe. And I think that's where the kind of crux lies. And I have to say that knowing that we have a growing far right, I mean, of course, the center holds, as has been said, but it's always increasing because you do have a mistrust in the EU institutions as much as you have a distrust in democracy, and the two are linked. So I think it's also important to invest in democratic resilience, not only from external, interferences, but also domestically, and to bring people to understand that, it's a system that helps them. And I think for that you need, and it will be my last words, input and output legitimacy. I think you need to showcase that you do have legislation that helps citizens, that brings them something that is actually helpful for them. And at the same time, you need to make sure that there is more input in the sense of, participation, not just going to vote every 5 years, have a strong civil society, have a strong social cohesion, as has been mentioned. And that's all different kind of vis, as you say in French, or like little, things, screws that you can kind of work on. And that's quite difficult to bring together, I would say, because some of the competences, of course, are at EU level of what you can do, and some of them at national level.
Basically, get interested in politics, because otherwise politics gets interested in you, and that, I think, holds as well on the European level. You don't see it. I see two screens that are manically blinking red, which I think means we have to leave the stage. There will be something in the next, there will be a short break now. I could talk on for hours with you, but we have to stop. Thank you so much. I learned a lot. I hope you learned a lot. There were questions about why trains don't work as well as they do. I had to omit that. But I suggest to the Alpbach Forum organizers that would be a wonderful topic for some case study for the next year. Get some railway policy experts together with participants here. You already had that session. Well,
there is a session on
Oliver, there you go. Very good,
Oliver, for next year, can I just say one thing on populism? Why don't you invite to places like that Eurosceptics
Good idea.
who disagree with all of us? Because we never talk to them. We should address their problems.
I see Andreas Teichel there. I think he's anxiously taking notes for next year's. All right. Thank you so much. Have a good rest of the week and a splendid forum. And safe trips back home.